Hello, everybody. Welcome to Archeo Viking. Today, me and my co-host Ryan, who
Hey everybody.
co-hosted with me on my very first video on the channel, are going to cover the Great Sioux War in honor of uh, Sitting Bull, as this is his 100th anniversary, I believe, of his death. Um, Now, first of all, before we go into the video, I want to say that Sioux is not the preferred term of any of the Lakota, Dakota, or Akota, or any other members of these various tribes. They prefer those names that I mentioned. However, as this is the official title of it, the Great Sioux War, this is what we will refer uh, it as in the video. So I want to mention this because I want people to understand that the actual titles that these tribes prefer, and I want to let anyone from these tribes who may be watching know that I'm fully aware of the proper titles, and I will refer to them as the proper titles in the video. And I apologize that we have to refer to this event as what it is, but unfortunately, until we have a better title, this is what we have to use.
Yeah, and apologize for any
Yes,
mispronunciations.
yes, because I mispronunciate things from my culture, so I can't promise to even pronounce things properly from other cultures, and I completely
Me
apologize
too.
ahead of time. So it's not anything against your culture. It's just we're terrible at pronouncing things in general. So, with all due, let's begin. So the tribes that would make up what is the unappropriate term Sioux, the Dakota, Akota, and Lakota, are tribes that originated uh, at some point in what is now modern day Minnesota, and other places, including South Dakota, uh, with the exceptions of the Black Hills. And that's because, according to the 1870s chief American Horse, um, according to his own words and the Lakota's own history, the Lakota did not discover the Black Hills until roughly 1775 and 1776. Of course, there's some debate about whether or not they came here earlier, because it seems that he came up with those dates as a sort of a way to garner sympathy from the U.S. government. So they may full well have come here to the Black Hills earlier. But right now, the best way we can determine is that they came here in 1775 based off of his words, as well as archaeological evidence showing that they were still in Minnesota in the 1770s, along with primary documents showing that Dakota warriors went east to help the British in an attempt to retake Montreal from the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. The siege of Montreal did not go well for the British. They lost that battle. And they also went south with the British in an attempt to take St. Louis from the Spanish Empire. Yet another battle that did not go well for the British at this time. So the Lakota, Dakota, and Okota have been around for a while in this area. However, by the 1860s, the first of these so-called Sioux Wars had begun, specifically the Red Cloud's War, as well as other wars amongst the Sioux, amongst the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, and other allied tribes. And it sort of was a mixed bag. First, there was the Fetterman fight, or Fetterman's massacre, in which Red Cloud, Lakota chief, defeated the U.S. cavalry at this battle in 1866. And then you had the so-called Sand Creek Massacre, where U.S. cavalry at night charged into a village made up of mostly women and children and the elderly, and utterly slaughtered them. an event that was so bad that even the U.S. Congress condemned it, and many of the soldiers. I will have linked in the sources these reports in which many of the testimony of these soldiers who, at least in their own words, refused to take part. Whether or not they actually did is up for debate, but in their own words, they refused to take part because they saw it as such a horrifying event. And then you had the Dakota War of 1862, or the Great Dakota Uprising, in which the Dakota tribe rose up to defend their lands from encroaching U.S. military. And unfortunately, they lost the war rather horribly. And many of the leaders were arrested and were set for execution. Now, some of them were granted amnesty by the U.S. government, but 38 of them were still promptly executed on the gallows that you see in the picture. And actually, a couple of years later, 2 more of these men were found and then hanged again. So it's technically 30, it's called 38 plus 2, technically. So it was 40, but the original count was 38. And it was a very unfortunate event that modern historians state, based off of the Constitution and a variety of other things, and lawyers, even modern lawyers, state that this was clearly not an exercise of law or law and order. It was an exercise of power. It was a show of force and power and nothing more. Who was this person that was showing this force and power? Well, this is where I'm going to leave it off to my co-host, because the person who excised this show of force and power was none other than our 16th president, Abraham
Lincoln. Yeah. So Lincoln's, and I think this is, I think this is the largest mass execution in U.S. history.
That is exactly it.
And originally there were like 300 and some who were sent to Lincoln for capital punishment. And Lincoln narrowed it down to 38, which still just an amazing thing, right? And there, I mean, there's a lot going on right in the 1840s to the 1860s that impacts Native Americans. Manifest Destiny is pushing west. Many of the Plains and Rocky Mountain natives are encountering what the Eastern seaboard tribes had encountered in the 16 and 1700s, and that is basically just being pushed off of their land. And the white Europeans not really recognizing native rights to pretty much anything. With Lincoln, with what was going on in 1862, obviously we're in the second year of the Civil War. Okay? First year not going very well at all for the United States. I tend to not use the terms Union and Confederacy. I like to use the terms United States and traitors when I teach it, but
because that's the proper term.
For those, yeah, those are proper terms. Actually the Union, the idea of calling it the Union only during the Civil War kind of comes from lost cause ideology. Because we're the United States up until the Civil War starts, and then all of a sudden we're the Union, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But anyways, 1861 did not go very well for the United States. The Confederate States are holding on to a defensive strategy. They're hoping that England will come in. They win a couple of major battles in 1861. It doesn't look good for us. And in 1862 is kind of where you start to see the turnaround of the Civil War. Now, we usually don't have the turning points until Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July of 1863. But in 1862, you have the Battle of Shiloh, you have the Siege of Fort Donelson, and basically the United States retaking Tennessee. You have later on in September, you have the Battle of Antietam, which was, for as far as casualties, probably the worst day in U.S. history for the military. 20-some thousand casualties in a matter of hours. But the battle comes out on top for the United States, and that battle is what allows Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So that's kind of what you got going on here. With as far as Native American policy, Lincoln pretty much so preoccupied with the Civil War that he just maintains what previous policy had been, which was essentially assimilation. Okay? Make treaties, remove natives to reservations, and open it up for the white settler. Okay? And that's kind of what you see in the 1840s and the 1850s before the Civil War. And then once the Civil War starts, Lincoln just kind of maintains that policy.
Yep. Yep, and that's exactly it, and that's where you see this execution and these massacres and Red Cloud's War.
Yeah, it's all about manifest destiny. It's all about taking back or taking the territory, and the European ideal of that the natives, it's not their land because they haven't worked the land, they haven't changed it.
Yeah, so. Exactly. Fortunately, also not fortunately, in 1868, Red Cloud and other Lakota and Dakota and various other tribes, including the Cheyenne, were able to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Technically the second one, but it's the most well-known one, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, in which the Lakota, Dakota, and Okota were given the boundaries that you see in this map, which included North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And only the federal government could try Lakota and other American Indians in court. And it also included American Indians who committed crimes against U.S. soldiers and vice versa. But it also really didn't last very long.
Right, because they, I mean, a lot of the natives took sides during the American Civil War too.
Yep. But
which we mentioned the last time in our Cherokee video.
Yeah, exactly.
It's fairly complicated because even within tribes, it would split the various groups.
And it really came to a head during this figure's presidency, Ulysses S. Grant, in an event also called the Long Depression, which I will give to again to our my co-host, as he knows about these events better than I do.
I'll try.
Yeah.
So Lincoln had actually, in his State of the Union addresses in 1863 and 1864, after he had sentenced this record number of people to be hanged to death, suggested that we change our Native American policy. And he did this in 3 consecutive State of the Union addresses in 62, 63, and 64. But none of it really pans out. They keep maintaining the same policy, and Grant kind of inherits that policy. After Lincoln's assassination, Johnson takes over, and of course Johnson doesn't get along with the radical Republicans in Congress. Johnson really is more of a Jacksonian Democrat. Lincoln was trying to look forward and basically pick Johnson to try to heal or bring the Southern and Northern whites back together after the war. And then unfortunately we have his assassination in April of 1865. With Johnson, of course, he is a white supremacist. He makes no bones about that. He's the only Southern politician that stays in the United States. He was a senator from Tennessee at the time, very humble backgrounds from Eastern Tennessee. Very kind of astute politician, even though he had very much trouble reading and writing because he didn't learn until he was an adult. After Johnson is ushered out, so to speak. In the election of 1868, the Republican Party chooses Ulysses S. Grant, which during the 1800s works incredibly well to run for president. You just find you a general who's famous and run him, and he's pretty much a shoe-in to win. With Grant, Grant was well, it's debatable whether he's even a good general or not, but he was a popular general, and his presidency, he's not a good politician. I would say that he's not a good president in that. I'd like to kind of explain it this way. In the military, you give an order, it's carried out. Grant took this attitude into the White House, and that's not how politics works, right? And so under Grant, we have what is called Grantism, which is this huge amount of corruption going on, mainly because of the rebuilding during Reconstruction. Grant's going to be president for most of Reconstruction. And that's another topic altogether, the reinstituting the South, because it's also probably one of the deadliest periods for African Americans in the country. All sorts of massacres going on in the South. Usually don't make it into textbooks, like the Colfax massacre in Louisiana, as an example. Grantism is all of these scandals that come to light. There's the whiskey ring, the tax ring. You've got the big one is the credit mobilier scandal, which leads to the failure of the Northern railroads under Jay Cook. I think it's Northern Railroads, it's Jay Cook's company. Hold on a minute. Northern Pacific Railway, right? And by 1873, this is in second term of Grant, you've got this kind of perfect storm that happens with the Panic of 1873. The financial crises of the 1800s all pretty much have two things in common: easy credit and speculation, usually in land. We still haven't really got a solid monetary policy. That's up for debate. There still isn't really a solidified central banking system like, well, modern day central banking system. And so these ebbs and flows of capitalism, the boom bust cycle, about every 20 years, you see a financial crisis. And this kind of, the 1873 is when it hits. Okay. This is also the first economic crisis that really kind of incorporates all Americans. This is the first one that you're going to see massive protests of the working class, as average Joe Smith American has moved from farmer to factory worker. And so as you can see here in the picture, you see a lot of runs on banks, banks operating on a fractional reserve system, never have the amount of money that they have on the books in the bank. And so when panics happened, everyone would try to rush in and get their specie, their hard currency, their gold or silver, which the banks didn't have. And bank failures, of course, compound the financial crisis. So that's a quick rundown of Grant's presidency and going into it. Now, his Native American policy pretty much is going to stay the same as Lincoln's and everyone else's.
Yep. In fact, as I said, the reason the Treaty of Fort Laramie sort of fell apart during the Grant presidency is because he sent essentially what can be called the Custer Expedition, also known as the Expedition of 1874, in which he sends, at the time, I forget his rank, I think he was still a major or lieutenant colonel. He sends none other than George Armstrong Custer out west with an entourage of several hundred soldiers, as well as surveyors and miners, to sort of confirm rumors that they had heard of that gold had been found in the Black Hills, under the stipulation that he was not to let anybody know, because they wanted to approach the Lakota, Dakota, and Okota and other tribes in the area first to negotiate, or at least that's the story that Grant and his Secretary of Defense at the time, Sherman, wanted. That's what they claimed.
Which is John Sherman, the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman.
Sherman, yeah. Yep, exactly. So this is the story that they claimed. So whether or not that's true is up for debate. But again, it's one of those where we have to sort of take their word that they wanted to approach the tribes first. But, and this is a big but, George Armstrong Custer was a narcissist and an egotist of a Herculean order. He and this is from the accounts of soldiers who served both under and with him. He was obsessed with his hair, he was obsessed with his looks, and he was obsessed with getting the credit for everything. So when he did in fact find the gold in the Black Hills, he disobeyed orders and sent letters to all the major news outlets in the East saying that he found gold. So
which creates a run.
Yeah. So by the time Grant and Sherman found out, they couldn't really do anything, or again, according to them. And thus you have this gold rush that you see on the right side of the picture happening in the Black Hills. And because of that, you have the so-called Great Sioux War breakout in it, in which massive battles were fought until the late 1780s, arguably the late 1880s, not 1780s, arguably the 1890s. But because of that, this also runs contrary to the so-called westward expansion, which my co-host already mentioned, manifest destiny. So you see in this picture right here, the East is beginning to encroach on the West, or also the West, technically, if you count San Francisco is beginning to encroach on the East.
I always talk about it. It's like we go to the Mississippi River and it kind of stalls, and then the gold rush of 1849, and then it kind of comes in together.
And then you see these transcontinental railroads being propping up.
Right, and that's kind of the big impetus is the Transcontinental Railroad. Which was passed in the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 is what prompted what funded and gave the land to the railroad companies to build the first transcontinental railway.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is beginning to encroach on the West, and then you have people in California doing sort of a similar thing. In fact, I'm a link in the iCard, a very important documentary talking about San Francisco in California's own sort of genocide. It was a genocide. Their own genocide of the native peoples in California, in which they actually had bounties out on
the state of California, the government did.
They had bounties out for scalps on American Indians and such in California, which was technically illegal because they were under the U.S. government considered citizens, but they didn't give these citizens these tribes the right to go to court. In fact, they banned them from being able to go to court. So
and I would say kudos to Governor Gavin Newsom for acknowledging the California genocide and apologizing for it. And that's kind of, I believe he's the first governor ever to do such a thing.
I think
towards
so.
Native Americans.
I think so. So then we have the Indian policy of the 1880s, and as just like the disclaimer in the above on this picture says, I want to say this does not reflect anything either I or my co-host believes whatsoever, but this picture is important because it shows sort of the dehumanizing aspect that the U.S. was using on the American Indians, and it's unfortunate that this existed, but people far too often don't bring these pictures up, and that's why we have certain events that neither my co-hosts or I are going to mention in detail, but people probably know about the certain events in the current education system where they're trying to hide pictures like this, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term.
Yeah, and you know, this is typical of the 1880s, 1890s political cartoons in Harper's Weekly, Puck magazine, Judge magazine, and the racist stereotypes of not just Native Americans, but also Chinese and African Americans and Irish Americans were pretty much standard throughout the period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's just, this is the way they used it to justify the actions by making them look like, you know, this is where we get the drunk Indian
Yeah, the uncivilized, barbaric. These are all terms used to dehumanize Native peoples.
Savages, yeah, which is still used by racists today, unfortunately.
Yeah, and going all the way back to
the
Columbus and Bartolome de las Casas and Sepulveda, all those guys.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the U.S. Constitution even.
Yeah.
But because, you know, despite this, the Great Sioux War does, for at least a little while, go well for the Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and such. With two of the best examples are the battles that you see in this picture. One, the Battle of Rosebud, in which Crazy Horse, also known as, more properly known as Tashunke Wiko by the Lakota, and various other Cheyenne and Arapaho and other tribes, launched an attack on the U.S. cavalry that was marching into Lakota territory, and were able to stall them and make them retreat. Not a lot of deaths happened on either side of the battle, but that wasn't the purpose of the attack. The attack was to stall their march into Lakota territory so that they could also not reinforce U.S. troops that were already there. So it is very much a victory for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that they accomplished this.
Yeah.
And then the other very well-known battle is the battle that we most commonly know as the Battle of Little Bighorn. However, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho prefer the term the Battle of Greasy Grass. So,
which was their name for the little creek. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's something that I frankly feel like we should change the name to, because they won the battle. Why are we naming the battle after, you know, naming the battle that we lost? We should let them name the battle. But anyways, so Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer marched with, I forget the exact number, because the number who died were 200, but he had more.
Yeah, he divided it up into threes.
And so it's actually a common misconception that all of his forces died in this battle. In fact, the other two Collins didn't. They were actually held off by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and were not actually able to get to the main battlefield. And by the time they figured out what was going on, they had retreated. So that's something to remember, that it wasn't actually as big of a massacre as it could have been. Right. But it was very much a big massacre, and a great, understandably so, a great source of pride for these tribes, because they were able to defeat the U.S. cavalry in this battle and score the second largest military defeat that the American Indian ever got against the U.S. Army, the largest being St. Clair's defeat, which was 600. And so they were able to.
And a lot of this is largely due to Custer's arrogance.
And egotism, because he was actually ordered by his commanding officers to wait for them to get there. And he was just like, no, I want the credit for myself. And I also like to imagine that someone recognized him, was like, oh, I recognize you. You're the reason we're in this whole mess.
Yeah. Right. And took him out.
Yeah. So, needless to say, they won that battle. Unfortunately, the rest of the Sioux War did not necessarily go well. However, we'll cover that a little later. Right now, I want to cover some important figures in this conflict. Now, I have not included a picture of Armstrong, Custer, or any Union soldiers because, for lack of a better term, fuck them, because they did horrible things to people. And even the good ones were like, no, kill the Indian, save the man, which is terrible. And I'll cover that once we get later on in the video.
Very, very much like the Inquisition.
Exactly. However, important figures at this time included the figure to your right, Tashunke Whitco, or Crazy Horse, who was, despite common misconception, was not actually a chief. He was just a leader of a war band. He did at one point get awarded a honor of being called a white shirt because he was given a white shirt that was very ritually significant to his tribe. However, he lost it due to a few reasons, one specifically that he had an affair with another man's woman, or at least that's the story I've heard. If there are any Lakota who are watching and want to correct me on that, please do. I would like to have correct information. It's just this is what I have heard. And then he was known for having a vision quest that gave him a prophecy that he would never be wounded or killed by a bullet, which, according to all accounts, actually happened. But when he did die, it would be he would die in the hands of his own people, and that's also did happen because when he was eventually executed, he was grabbed by a couple of Sioux Lakota, who probably didn't know what was actually happening, but they were ordered to grab a hold of him, and then two U.S. soldiers stabbed him with bayonets and killed him. And then in the middle, we have somebody who did survive until old age, Morning Star, a Cheyenne chief who was very well known in this period and had won a lot of battles. And then to the far left, we have yet another figure, the figure that this video is in honor of, Sitting Bull, who again was not actually a chief. He was a war chief and a war band leader, but he gained a lot of notoriety. And just like Crazy Horse, any warrior who gained notoriety in the U.S.'s eyes suddenly became a chief, even though they weren't actually a chief. And he was the one behind the successful Battle of Greasy Grass, Little Bighorn, and helped win a lot of battles. But eventually he did, much like Tashunke Whitco, Crazy Horse, he turned himself in to the U.S. Military and the U.S. government. And for a while, traveled around with a figure we'll talk about in a little while, Buffalo Bill Cody, in his Wild West Circus. But he also eventually didn't really like that very much and went back to the reservation, where unfortunately in December 15th of 1890, he was executed due to suspicion of him supporting the Ghost Dance movement, which we will also cover later on in the video. Very unfortunate, and it's also important to note that his death probably actually strengthened the Ghost Dance movement rather than hurt it. In fact, if they had left him alive, it probably would not have gained as much traction as it would have. Of course, there's no way to know that for sure, but there is a definite correlation. Whether or not that's causation is up for debate, but it did happen. So one of the things that also happened during this time period were extermination efforts by the U.S. military. One of the most widely used was the extermination of the buffalo.
Right.
And that picture in the far left is an actual historical picture, and you can see just how ridiculously high that was. In fact, William Tecumseh Sherman is one of the generals who gave the order. He knew how important the buffalo were to plains tribes such as the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Crow, and various other tribes. And so he is reported to have given the order saying that if we kill kill the buffalo, we kill them. And the U.S. military loved the idea of this. In fact, this is sort of where Buffalo Bill Cody, the figure in the right, got his start. And other figures such.
And a lot of the railroad companies hired
Yeah,
hunters too, like
yeah, well, including Buffalo Bill Cody.
yeah.
In fact, there were soldiers such as Colonel Homer W. Wheeler, whose autobiography will have linked in the sources. He got his start as a buffalo hunter and continued that in the U.S. military. And then the railroad, as my co-host mentioned, hired buffalo hunters to kill buffalo. Not necessarily for the same reasons as the U.S. military. It was more of to get them off of their railroads.
Yeah.
There was some of that racism in it as well, but it was mainly
Yeah, it was taking out two things for
two,
them. It
yeah,
was two problems with one stone.
two birds with one stone. And
Clearing, because the most like the buffalo herds of this period are well, even way before this, but at
were
this point they've dwindled quite a bit. But even at this point, they're massive.
Yeah, they literally blacked out the plains, and so by hiring professional buffalo hunters like William H. Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody, and even Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson in their earlier careers before they became career lawmen, uh, participated in this. And so they killed all of these. In fact, this is where you
Yeah.
get the term sharpshooter, because people who used Sharps rifles used them on buffalo.
Right. And it's interesting fact, because I talk about this in my U.S. history courses, but one of the things about buffalo or the American bison is that once one of them goes down from a shot, the other animals don't know exactly what's going on, so they surround it.
Yeah.
And that actually helps the hunters more, because if they take one down, then you've got this mass of animals around it, and they just keep shooting. And the sad part is like, as you see, I think there's another really famous picture in Dodge City of about 300,000 hides,
Yeah.
and it's popped up
Really
because basically they took the hides and they took the tongues, and that's it.
Yep, exactly. And people like William H. Cody and Colonel Wooler bragged about this. It should also be noted that Buffalo Bill Cody, specifically, and not just him, a lot of them were really large liars. They were compulsive liars.
They love to exaggerate their own accomplishments.
Yeah, William H. Cody even claimed he saw the bones of giant human beings in his autobiography, and claimed that his army surgeon said that they were without a doubt human. Of course, whether or not this is something he's making up, or it was, say, mammoth or dinosaur bones that they saw and just miscategorized, is up for debate. But he still lied about this, and he's the reason that we have this cowboys and Indians image that is still pervasive in things like Pocahontas and stuff. And Old Yeller is another good thing, because at the end of Old Yeller, the father brings a headdress and a tomahawk to his son, and that's why we have these things, which is very unfortunate, but it was very effective that these extermination efforts happened. And now they weren't the only ones, and we'll cover another one later. But right now, I'm going to pass it off to my co-host to talk about the Gilded Age and the economic panic of 1893 that happened around this time.
All right. So I'm going to try to condense a lot into a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So please bear with me.
Yeah.
Pretty much from the end of the American Civil War, even during the Reconstruction period, we are seeing the ascent of industrialization. And with that, we are seeing the increase in wealth to a very select few at the top. Mark Twain deemed the period, the 1880s and the 1890s, the Gilded Age, because of this seemingly, it's like anything is gilded. Something that's gilded is gold covered, right? It looks really nice on the outside, but if you kind of scrape through it a little bit, it's crap, right? It could be anything. And that's what Twain used to describe the period, because like he said, everything looks great on paper. Stock markets are going up. The industrialization is growing. Everything's on the up and up. But if you kind of dig a little bit, there are huge amounts of problems, some of which are created by industrialization. Others have been persisting from earlier periods, right? We moved from slavery to Jim Crow, right? With the election of Rutherford B. Hayes in 1877, the election of 1876, and his kind of selection over Samuel J. Tilden, even though he didn't really win, ends Reconstruction. Part of Hayes becoming president was he agrees to take the military out of the South, ending Reconstruction and creating Jim Crow. So we have this economic growth, leaps and bounds throughout the 1880s and 1890s, most of which is driven by the railroads. The railroads, you have to have iron, steel, lumber, coal. So all these other industries are also growing along with building not just the first transcontinental railroad, but then other transcontinental railroads and linking California to the east. Okay. So we get to 1893, and the biggest, of course, again, this is that boom bust cycle that we see throughout the 1800s, and two things that are always present: easy credit and speculation. And this financial crisis is prompted by the failure of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, which was one of the largest employers in the United States at the time. Okay. There are also other factors. A lot of these financial crises are perfect storms of events that have their roots sometimes 10, 20 years before it, right? I don't want to sound too simplistic, because these are complex, nuanced things. They do occur about every 20 years, but every 20 years they're a little bit different, right? They're, who I can't remember the person who says it, but history doesn't repeat, but it surely does rhyme, right? And so we have a lot of that going on. You have the rise of the populists are going to be because of the Panic of 1893. Basically, this sets up the election of 1896, which is one of the most important elections in U.S. history, and really kind of sets us up for becoming the king of the hill, and establishing U.S. hegemony throughout the world.
Yep, and that leads me into the next subject I wanted you to cover. The U.S.'s involvement in the Mexican Revolution, specifically against Pancho Villa, of which actually my great 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 granduncle was part of, in the Spanish-American War.
Right.
They were part of this. So.
Right. So with and this is something that's kind of been going on for an incredibly long time. So originally, Manifest Destiny, people like to think from sea to shining sea, but originally Manifest Destiny was the whole continent. The idea early on was that the United States was going to spread not only from what our current borders are, of course, then it was only to the Mississippi. Their idea was they were going to take Canada, they were going to take Central America, they were going to take South America. They wanted the whole entire hemisphere. Okay. Even after the Mexican-American War in 1845, 1846, J. Polk was president, there was an all Mexico movement pushing for the annexation of all of Mexico at the time, right? So Mexico, of course, had always, they won their independence in 1819, 1820 from Spain. The Mexican government pretty much treated Native Americans pretty much how the United States government treats Native Americans. Okay. But the northern states of Mexico had always been resistant to what Mexico City had put out. And Pancho Villa is kind of like the epitome of that, right? And we with Pancho, that it's a little bit later, but we do send soldiers into Mexico to try to get Pancho Villa. Okay, obviously we don't, but yeah. And with the Spanish American War, that is kind of our first time that we enter into a conflict claiming to bring about democracy, but we have a lot of ulterior motives.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of ulterior motives. We have coveted Cuba since the early 1800s, going back to the pre-Civil War with Franklin Pierce and his ill-fated Austin Manifesto, where he tries to buy Cuba. Doesn't look really good on his part, because at that point the South pretty much wanted it to extend slavery. But we've always coveted Cuba, right? And because the Spanish had held on to Cuba, we see the rise of yellow journalism with Pulitzer and Hearst, pushing the idea that the Cuban people are being heavily discriminated against, put into concentration camps. The Cuban people had rose up against the Spanish Empire, were trying to overthrow them. Weyler, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was the general in charge, and he pretty much puts them, all right, I don't know who's who, I'm going to put them all in concentration camps. And hundreds with thousands of people dying because of that. And Hearst and Pulitzer seize on that and basically push for war, right? Hearst is famously quoted as, this is like one of those Marie Antoinette quotes. Marie Antoinette was like, oh, let them eat cake, but she never actually said it, but it fit her personality and stuff.
Yeah.
So Hearst is reportedly says to one of his photographers, you give me the pictures, I'll furnish the war.
Yeah.
And even though we don't have any evidence that he actually said that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the ulterior motive is land.
Mm-hmm.
It's imperialism. To put it into a greater context, the 1880s, we're seeing the second round of European imperialism in Africa and in Asia. You have Cecil Rhodes, you have the Zulu Wars. All of that stuff is going on, and the United States government sees that feels that if they're going to be a player on the world stage, they too must seek empire. And the Spanish American War is really kind of about that, because we defeat the Spanish fairly quickly.
Yeah, Spain was very much a shadow of its former self.
Yeah, really big shadow of its former self.
Yeah.
I mean, we defeated the Spanish Navy in the Philippines so quickly that we didn't even have people to go ashore.
Mm-hmm.
Right, we had to wait months for that to go ashore. We pretty much finished the Spanish American War in about 6 months.
Yeah.
Okay? Now there are elements within the United States that are anti-imperialist, and there's a very famous anti-imperialist league. Mark Twain's a part of that, because we fight in the Philippines for another 3 years after this, because the Filipino people thought that we were coming to liberate them, just like the Cubans, and then we stayed, and they're like, what the hell? So Emilio Aguinaldo leads, he had led against the Spanish, now he's going to lead against the United States.
A very, very underrepresented war.
Yes, very much so.
And one of the things I wanted to touch on is that these events are oftentimes were Southerners who were veterans of the Civil War were chomping at the bit, and that's
Oh
one
yeah.
of the things I wanted to touch on is that that Southerners were by far the majority of people who enlisted in the army during the Villa Expedition, the Spanish American War, and various other things.
Yeah.
Something a lot of people don't know. U.S. military was also sent um, to China and Korea during the Taiping Uprising and various civil wars in Korea as well. So
Yeah.
so people from the South and the Midwest, because much like now, this is where a lot of conservative people were. They chomped at the bit to go out there and
Oh yeah.
make a
And
name
not,
for
yeah.
themselves.
And then later on, Nicaragua,
Yeah,
Honduras,
exactly.
and we had, by the way, we had been in those areas since the 1840s,
Yeah,
1850s. I mean, the
exactly.
filibustering of the 1850s is something that no one really talks about either.
Hmm.
But we tried to conquer Nicaragua and Honduras and do a Texas on them.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So
It,
with
it
that,
basically it basically
yeah.
sets the stage for this imperialist
Mhm.
ideal that
Yep, and that's exactly it. We were imperialists, and that's why I wanted to bring this up, because the events that were happening in the world are the same reasons we were doing these things to the Lakota and other Plains tribes, imperialism.
right.
And unfortunately, around the same decade that the Spanish American War and the Filipino insurrection, as we call it, where massive atrocities were uh, committed against the Filipino people. Uh, the event known as the Massacre of Wounded Knee happened, where um, so basically what happened with Wounded Knee is, for a couple of years before then, an event, a religious movement had been happening known as the Ghost Dance, where a Paiute, or I don't remember if it was Paiute or Ute. There's actually a couple of different tribes that
I think he was
fall under.
Paiute though that
Yeah,
started it.
yep. He was called the Prophet, and which is, he's not the first American Indian to call themselves to be called the Prophet or call themselves the
Right.
Prophet. The brother of Tecumseh is another example of that. Um,
Squattawa.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yep. But he moves east, and he begins preaching to the various Plains tribes that they begin this ghost dance, that all of the dead warriors of the past from every tribe will rise up and they will fight back and retake their land. And everyone loved it. I mean, it made it even as far south as the Apache, and other tribes, including the Dene, more commonly known as Navajo, but they prefer to call themselves the
The
Dene.
name.
Yeah, and if there are any Apache listeners, if you have a preferred term, please feel free to let us know. We will start calling you that. So it was a very widespread movement. Unfortunately, this made the U.S. military very, very nervous. Uh,
Mhm.
Sort of understandably so, because of course it looked like there was about to be a massive organized uprising. So I can sort of, to a point, see it. And this is the only room I'm going to give the U.S. military whatsoever in what we're about to talk about, is you can sort of, it's something we call in the history business, understandable but not acceptable. It's understandable that they came to this conclusion, but it's not acceptable what they did.
Right.
And so what happened in response to this movement, the U.S. military at Wounded Knee began to gather up all the firearms that this group of Lakota had. Um, and as the from what I understand from the accounts, every account I've read, is what happened is while they were trying, one soldier was trying to take a rifle from a Lakota man. He was deaf, and he was already trying bringing the rifle to the pile, but he didn't understand what the U.S. soldier was trying to do, and he was trying to do, and this is again from both U.S. and Lakota perspectives, all he was trying to do was pull his rifle away. And apparently, according to some accounts, a few of the tribe and even a few of the soldiers were trying to tell the soldier in question that, hey, he's deaf. But unfortunately, in the scuffle, a shot was fired, and the U.S. military assumed that the Lakota were attacking, and they brutally slaughtered everyone, over 200 Lakota. There were a few survivors, but it was a horrible, horrible massacre that should never have happened.
Right.
And I'm not sure, and I may be corrected, but I believe the U.S. government has apologized since then. But of course, they may not have, because the U.S. government is known for not doing that at all. But this happened, and it was sort of the death knell to any sort of possible resurgence of fighting that would have happened. It wasn't quite, there still was some for up until even the early 1900s, but it was sort of the death knell to any major fighting. And it's unfortunate that this massacre even happened at all. But it is is the most well-known, understandably so, U.S. Massacre of American Indians. Something that will ever live, to quote FDR, will forever live in infamy.
Okay. I just, you were right. Congress apologized to Wounded Knee victims in 1990.
Okay, so good. They did at least apologize. Again, they don't do it enough, but we'll at least acknowledge that they did that. So the next sort of most long-lasting extermination event that the U.S. government did was what was called the U.S. government and Canada, and also Mexico. With recent events, Mexico has been brought up, but not brought up as much as it should be. There was what was called these boarding schools or residential schools in Canada, where Native American Indian children were taken away from their families and brought to these schools to be turned to be civilized. This is where the term "kill the Indian, save the man" that so many people, even people who were like Colonel Wheeler, who was generally pro-American Indian, viewed this as the proper way to do it. Oh, we can save them by civilizing them and destroying their culture. And
it's definitely the white savior movement, this goes all the way back to Spain and Columbus, and I usually look at it going back, because in my classes I talk about the debate between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Sepulveda very early on. And what you see is, because they're, for Europeans, for Christendom, the finding of the New World was a conundrum, because this isn't mentioned in the Bible at all, these New World and these new people. So there was a debate on whether or not these natives were actually human beings or not. And Sepulveda kind of was like, well, they must be demons, so it's okay to kill them and take their land. Whereas Bartolomé Las Casas kind of sets the stage and says that they're human beings, they just don't know any better. Right? And so we have that paternalism aspect of social Darwinistic thought that comes into it, and this is where the boarding schools come from. It comes from Christian. It comes from Christian missionaries.
Especially Catholic missionaries. And so they build these boarding schools. And you see this picture I have here. I chose this picture for a very specific reason. This is the same young man. But you see, for one thing, he's wearing European garb, and we talked on this in our the last video that Ryan and I co-hosted about the attempts from the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, and Creek, to have European garb, and this is sort of a continuation of that idea. But you also notice that in the picture on the right, he's a little bit paler than the picture on the left, and this is for a variety of reasons. One, the most benign is photographers used specific styles of lighting and angles to get this, but that wasn't the only thing. They also starved and beat and a variety of other things to make these kids as malnourished as possible, so that when they took these pictures, they looked white because they were malnourished and didn't have the nutrients in their skin like they should.
Yeah. They weren't allowed to use their own language.
Yep.
The,
Yeah.
they had to learn English or be beaten.
Yep, and that's where we go into this. This is why it's so God. This is where we're gonna get a little more serious than my co-host and I had previously been. It's so ignorant and so horrible to even, and insensitive to even use terms like, "Oh, we conquered them. Sorry, we conquered you. Get over it." No, we didn't. We committed genocide. The last boarding schools in the U.S. at least got closed down in 1990, and in this previous year, people have finally begun listening to the American Indians and begun finding these unmarked graves of thousands of American Indian children. The current count is I think 7,100 children, and we're not even done counting. We've only done a handful of schools.
Yeah, and those are mostly in Canada.
Mostly in Canada, they did check one school in Pennsylvania and several schools out west in Montana and South Dakota and such, and it's still not even close. And so that's why I brought this up, is that the Great Sioux War, again, the term Sioux is wrong. It's Lakota, Dakota, and Akota, and I know they have a proper term for the Union, and I just am not thinking of it right now. I'm not going to attempt to butcher that out of respect for these tribes. But for another thing, what we did in these wars is still going on. We created these boarding schools, and we committed a genocide, and they are still fighting it. They were still not allowed to practice their religion until the 1970s, and the last boarding schools weren't closed until the 90s. So this is something that people need to be aware of, and that recent events in the U.S. education system need to be fought severely, because we are ignoring the plight of these people. Another thing they did, the reason we have the nutrition barcodes, or whatever you want to call them, on the sides of cans and cereal boxes and such, is because of these starving of these peoples. They specifically starved these children to determine what was the essential nutrients of people. So they did horrible things to these people. They forcibly sterilized them, even as far back as the 1990s and 80s.
Yeah.
So no, this was not a conquest. This was a genocide, where people were, even according to the U.S. Congress, where people were slaughtered in the middle of the night by U.S. cavalry, where California had bounties for scalps and then refused to acknowledge any legal cases from American Indians. So this is why this is such important to bring up, especially on the anniversary of the death of Sitting Bull, is because what we did to him, what we did to his people, should not ever be forgotten, and it should be acknowledged always. And the fact that it has been ignored, with the exception of things like Wounded Knee occasionally, is a disservice to their culture. It's not something that should ever have been done. And so,
right. And with U.S. policy and stuff, we, and our social Darwinistic attitudes towards Native Americans, there's a lot of evidence. This is where Hitler gets a lot of his ideas.
Yes.
Especially for Hitler's idea of Lebensraum comes from Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, the idea of eugenics arose in the U.S. first.
Right.
Yeah. So this is something we have to acknowledge, because they are still finding their children to this day. And the news covered it for a little while, for about a month, and then completely dropped it. And that's something I had to hunt to find the current count, and that is a travesty. I truly want to be aware, continue looking out for this so I can educate people, and we can't find it because the U.S. and Canadian news system and media are not talking about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Just like Standing Rock went away.
Exactly. So with that in mind, for this video, I'm trying something different. I'm going to recommend 3 movies that I think will, to the best of their ability, convey these events that we talked about. The first is actually a 6-part miniseries of 6 2-hour-long episodes called Into the West, and it was very good. And it covers at first the family of the figure you see in the picture, this American trapper in the 1820s, who, after he gets to the Great Plains, rescues a Lakota woman and falls in love. Now,
is this a fictional character?
Yeah, he's a fictional character.
Okay, because it kind of sounds like Jebediah Smith, but
no. But the thing is, this could have easily become yet another white savior motif, like Dances with Wolves, where the Lakota were in the background and they were background characters and he befriended them, but really it was about him and falling in love with the white woman who was raised by Lakota, and then he rallies them to kill the American cavalry at the end.
right.
But it doesn't do that. In fact, it does the opposite, and that's why I love it. It does follow his family and his sons and his nephews and such, and himself in their attempts to help the Lakota and other Plains tribes in whatever way. The savior is actually his brother-in-law, a Lakota medicine man who has a vision that it is his destiny to save the Lakota. And I'm not going to explain how, of course, I don't want to ruin it, but it follows his family as well as the trapper's family, all the way from the 1820s all the way up to the Wounded Knee massacre. And it beautifully does it. It beautifully portrays the West and the horrible things that happened in all these extermination and assimilation events. And that's why I wanted to recommend this. The next was a recent movie from 2018 called Hostiles. Brilliantly done movie, starring the lady on the left, who I can never remember her name, but I'm not showing it for her.
Right. She's in the Wheel of Time now.
Yeah. Yes. But the main 2 people are Christian Bale and Wes Studi. Because of course Wes Studi would be cast. He's one of the only 4 American Indian actors that are ever cast. Right. But and the premise of the movie is Christian Bale plays this avidly racist cavalry colonel who is given a task of transporting Wes Studi's character, a Cheyenne chief, back to his traditional homelands because he is terminally ill and only has a couple of months to live, and the U.S. government has granted his request to be buried in his traditional homeland. Obviously something that's fictional because the U.S. government would have never done that.
Right.
But that's not the point. And so it explores these 2 lifetime rivals because they've been lifetime rivals. And it explores their realization, especially Christian Bale's realization, that really he has no room to talk in terms of why he has his fervent hatred. Because that's another thing. This video gives valid reasons for his hatred. Because that's another thing people don't tend to understand is while the U.S. government's policy was racist, every now and again you did have somebody who, for an understandable reason, again not acceptable, but an understandable reason, did truly hate various tribes, because in these constant push and pull of wars, collateral damage had happened, and oftentimes it was due to the loss of a family member. And he begins to realize that he, under what he did under orders of the U.S. government, he has no room to talk. And so it's an important look at the what actually happened in these wars, and why the U.S. government was wrong. Again, it could have easily gone into some sort of white savior motif, but it didn't. And it's a character study, and it's a beautifully done character study that I think everyone should watch to truly understand what the Indian Wars were like. And then the final video movie is one of my favorites, The Only Good Indian, again starring Wes Studi again. Yeah, and what it is about is Wes Studi plays for the first time. He actually plays his own tribe. He's Cherokee. He plays a Cherokee detective and veteran of the Civil War and Indian Wars who sort of lost his way. He's sort of disillusioned, and he's captures this boy who's escaped from these boarding schools and is bringing him back to the boarding school because there's a bounty on his head. But then he sort of begins to find his way, mainly because his longtime rival, a white Indian hunter, decides he wants the bounty as well. And why this video I think should be showed more is because it shows how truly horrible the boarding schools were. They're so horrible. This is a little spoiler, but it's important. They're so horrible that even the villain, the Indian hunter, he walks into a boarding school and sees it, and he tells all the Indian children to go home, and burns down the church and tells the priest, he's like, I've spent my whole life trying to exterminate these people from the face of the earth, and what you're doing is something more evil than I could ever imagine. So that's why it's so important, is it shows why these boarding schools were and still are so horrible, and shows that there's something that should never be justified. Unfortunately, I have had run-ins. I and a friend of both mine and Ryan's, somebody named Wolf the Red, have had run-ins with people before trying to justify the events happening in boarding schools. And this is why this movie should be is on the top. It's the last one I'm going to mention because it's so relevant and it's so well done, and it truly shows the horrors that all American Indians, including the Cherokee and the Lakota, went through in these boarding schools. So with that, that ends the video. I hope y'all enjoyed the video. Like, share, and subscribe. And Ryan and I definitely have plans later on to co-host a couple of other videos. So stay tuned for those, and please enjoy the video. And thank you, and have a good night.